Medical procedures cause people to be wary of hospitals. They are mistaken. The real horror comes from the gaps between rooms, moments of lost consciousness, and security cameras showing things that shouldn't be there. Tonight, every story is connected to something that challenges everything we think we know about the line between life and death. Reality and the impossible. The strangest part, everyone involved underwent multiple psychological evaluations. Every security camera was working perfectly. Every witness statement matched exactly. And when you finish reading these stories, you'll understand why I was transferred to a different hospital the very next week. Story 1. The Silent Corridor. Listen, being a night security guard at Metropolitan General wasn't supposed to be complicated. Walk the halls, check the doors, make sure nobody's where they shouldn't be. Simple enough, right? I'd been doing this job for 3 years without a single incident worth mentioning. But that all changed on a Tuesday night in October when I discovered that some corridors in hospitals, well, they don't follow the same rules as everywhere else. My name's Jake Morrison, and I've always prided myself on being the kind of guy who notices details. Dr. Patterson, our chief of staff, hired me specifically because I had military experience and what he called situational awareness. The pay was decent, the work was straightforward, and honestly, I liked the quiet. Most nights, the only sounds you'd hear were the hum of machines and the occasional footsteps of nurses doing their rounds. The third floor was always my favorite section to patrol. It housed the cardiology wing, and most patients there were stable, recovering from procedures. Room 318 through 335 stretched down a long corridor that ended at a large window overlooking the parking lot. During my usual 2 a.m. rounds, I'd walk that hallway, check each room, and head back to the security office. But on this particular night, something felt off the moment I stepped onto the third floor. The hallway was completely silent. Not the usual quiet, I mean absolutely, unnaturally silent. No humming from the machines. No distant conversations from the nurse's station. Nothing. It was like someone had pressed a mute button on the entire world. I thought maybe there was a power issue, so I checked the lights. Everything was working perfectly. The digital clocks on the walls showed the correct time, but that suffocating silence, it made my skin crawl. I started my usual walk down the corridor, and that's when I noticed her. A woman in a white nightgown was standing at the far end of the hallway, right by the window. Her back was turned to me, and she was perfectly still. Now patients aren't supposed to be wandering around at 2 a.m., especially not in that wing where most folks were connected to monitoring equipment. "Ma'am," I called out, but my voice seemed to get swallowed by the silence. It was like speaking into a vacuum. I walked closer, my footsteps echoing strangely in the empty corridor. "Ma'am, you need to get back to your room. It's not safe to be walking around without supervision." She didn't move, didn't even acknowledge that I was there. When I got about 10 feet away from her, I could see that she was looking out the window. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. In the reflection on that glass, I could see her face. Her eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire eyes. And she was smiling this wide, unnatural grin that stretched way too far across her face. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to turn around and come with me back to the nurse's station." That's when she spoke, but her voice came from right behind my ear, even though she was still standing 10 feet in front of me. "The corridor remembers everything, Jake." I spun around immediately, but there was nobody behind me. When I turned back toward the window, she was gone. My radio crackled to life. "Jake, this is dispatch. We just got an alert from the third floor. All monitoring equipment in rooms 318 through 335 went offline simultaneously. Can you check on that?" I looked at my watch. It was 2:47 a.m. I'd been in that corridor for 47 minutes, but it had felt like maybe 5 or 6 minutes at most. I ran to the nearest room, 322, and pushed open the door. The patient inside, an elderly man recovering from bypass surgery, was sitting up in bed, staring directly at me with the most terrified expression I'd ever seen. "She was here," he whispered. "The lady in white. She stood right there at the foot of my bed for 4 hours, just staring at me. I couldn't move, couldn't call for help. It was like time had stopped. I checked every room in that corridor. Same story. Every patient had seen the woman in white. Every patient described the same impossible experience, time stretching out, the inability to move or call for help, and that suffocating silence. But here's what really messed with my head. When I reviewed the security footage the next day, it showed me entering the 3rd floor at 2:03 a.m. and immediately turning around and leaving at 2:04 a.m. According to the cameras, I was never in that corridor for more than 60 seconds. Dr. Patterson called me into his office the following morning. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you experience anything unusual? During your rounds last night, I told him everything. The silence, the woman, the missing time." He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "That corridor," he finally said, "has a history. 20 years ago, we had a patient named Margaret Chen, room 325. She was recovering from heart surgery when she had some kind of psychotic break, started claiming that time was moving differently in her room, that the corridor was eating hours from her life." He pulled out an old file and showed me a photograph. It was the woman I'd seen by the window. She died in that room, Jake, but not from her heart condition. The nurses found her standing by the window at the end of the corridor. She'd been dead for at least 6 hours, but she was still standing upright, still smiling. The security footage from that night, it shows her walking into that corridor, but it never shows her walking out. I quit the next day, but before I left, I had to ask him, "Doctor, how many other security guards have seen her?" "You're the 7th, Jake, and every single one of you described the exact same experience. The silence, the missing time, and Margaret standing by that window." As I was packing up my office, one of the nurses, Linda, pulled me aside. "Jake, there's something Dr. Patterson didn't tell you about that corridor. Every patient who stayed in rooms 318 through 335 over the past 20 years has reported the same thing. They all say that during their stay, they lost time. Hours, sometimes entire days, just ... gone. And they all remember seeing Margaret." She looked around nervously before continuing. "The thing is, Jake, we don't put patients in those rooms anymore. Haven't for the last 5 years. Those rooms are supposed to be empty." "What do you mean?" "I mean the patients you talked to last night. According to our records, rooms 318 through 335 are all vacant, have been for years. I never went back to that hospital. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering, if those rooms were empty, who exactly did I talk to?" Story 2. The nurse who lost herself. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and I have been a registered nurse for 12 years. I've worked in trauma units, pediatric wards, and intensive care. I thought I'd seen everything the human body and mind could endure. But what happened to me at Metropolitan General made me question not just my profession, but my entire understanding of consciousness itself. I was working the night shift in the neurological intensive care unit. It's a demanding job, monitoring patients with severe brain injuries, strokes, and post-surgical cases. You need to be sharp, focused, and ready for anything, because neurological patients can deteriorate rapidly without warning. The NICU had 12 beds, but on this particular night, we only had 8 patients. One of them was a 34-year-old construction worker named Danny Reeves, who'd fallen from scaffolding and suffered a traumatic brain injury. He'd been in a coma for 6 days, and his brain activity was ... unpredictable. Around 11 p.m., I was updating Danny's chart when I started feeling dizzy. Just a little lightheaded, nothing serious. I figured I was dehydrated. 12-hour shifts can do that to you. I grabbed a bottle of water and sat down for a moment. That's the last thing I remember, clearly. What I'm about to tell you comes from security footage, witness statements, and medical records. Because for the next 4 hours, I have absolutely no memory of what happened. According to the night supervisor, Dr. Kim Walsh, I continued working normally for the rest of my shift. I checked on patients, administered medications, updated charts, everything a competent nurse should do. But here's the terrifying part. I was completely unconscious the entire time. The security cameras show me moving through the ward, but if you watch carefully, something's wrong. My movements are too fluid, too precise. I never hesitate, never check charts twice, never make the small human mistakes that everyone makes during a long shift. It's like watching a perfectly programmed robot that looks like Rebecca Martinez. But the patients noticed something different. Mrs. Henderson, in bed, for later told Dr. Walsh that when I came to check her vitals around midnight, my eyes were empty. She said I stared at her for almost 10 minutes without blinking, then suddenly started talking in a voice that didn't sound like mine. "Mrs. Henderson, you're going to have another stroke tomorrow at 3:47 p.m. It will be fatal this time." Then, according to her statement, I smiled and walked away. Mr. Torres in bed 7 reported something similar. He said I stood by his bed around 1 a.m. and told him that his daughter, who was flying in from Chicago to see him, would never make it because her plane would be delayed by mechanical problems. The most disturbing account came from the patient in bed 12, a teenage girl named Amy Chen who'd been in a car accident. She was conscious but couldn't speak due to her injuries. Amy later wrote that I had approached her bed around 2:30 a.m. and spent over an hour describing, in graphic detail, exactly how her accident had happened. But here's the impossible part. Amy had never told anyone the details of her accident. Her family didn't know. The police report was still being filed, yet somehow, while I was unconscious, I knew everything. At 3 a.m., Dr. Walsh found me in the supply closet, standing completely still, staring at a wall. She said my eyes were open, but I was clearly not conscious. When she called my name, I didn't respond. When she touched my shoulder, I collapsed. I woke up in the emergency room with no memory of the previous 4 hours. Dr. Walsh explained what had happened, and at first, I didn't believe her. Sleepwalking while working. It seemed impossible. But then she showed me the security footage. Watching yourself act like a completely different person while unconscious is one of the most disturbing experiences imaginable. The person in that video looked like me, sounded like me, but it wasn't me. There was something else controlling my body. The medical evaluation that followed was extensive. EEG, MRI, blood work, everything came back normal. Dr. Walsh consulted with neurologists, psychiatrists, and sleep specialists. No one could explain what had happened, but the predictions I'd made while unconscious, they all came true. Mrs. Henderson had her stroke the next day at exactly 3:47 p.m. and died within minutes. Mr. Torres's daughter's flight was delayed for 6 hours due to mechanical problems, and Amy's written account of her accident matched, word for word, what I had apparently described to her while I was unconscious. 3 days later, I was back on duty, but something had changed. I started experiencing what I can only describe as awareness gaps. I'd be in the middle of a conversation with a colleague, and suddenly I'd realize I was standing in a completely different part of the hospital, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Other staff members began reporting strange interactions with me. Dr. Phillips said. I approached him in the cafeteria and told him that his wife was having an affair with his brother. When he confronted me about it later, I had no memory of the conversation. But 2 weeks later, Dr. Phillips discovered it was true. Nurse Janet Sullivan claimed that I had warned her about a patient in room 504, who was going to attempt suicide by hanging himself with his bedsheets. Janet thought I was being paranoid, but she decided to check on the patient anyway. She found him in the middle of tying the sheets together. The most terrifying incident happened during my 5th night back on duty. I was working in the cardiac unit when I apparently approached the family of a patient who was undergoing emergency surgery. According to witnesses, I walked up to them in the waiting room and said, "Mr. Garrett didn't survive the surgery. The doctor will be out in 7 minutes to tell you. I'm sorry for your loss." The family was horrified and complained to the administration immediately. Dr. Walsh pulled me aside and demanded an explanation, but I had no memory of talking to anyone's family. We checked the surgical schedule. Mr. Garrett's surgery was still ongoing, and all indicators suggested it was going well. 7 minutes later, Dr. Reynolds came out to inform the family that Mr. Garrett had suffered massive cardiac arrest on the operating table and had passed away. That was my last night at Metropolitan General. I transferred to a different hospital the next week, but the episodes continued. I would lose consciousness, continue working, and somehow know things I shouldn't know. After 6 months of consultations with specialists across the country, I finally found a neurologist in Boston who had seen similar cases. Dr. Elena Vasquez told me something that changed my perspective completely. Rebecca, what you're experiencing isn't a medical condition. At least, not in any traditional sense. You're having what I call consciousness displacement events. For brief periods, your conscious mind steps aside, and something else takes control. Something else. I've studied 12 cases like yours over the past 15 years. All healthcare workers, all in hospitals with long histories. The pattern is always the same. Temporary loss of consciousness, continued professional function, and accurate predictions about future events. She showed me files from other cases, nurses, doctors, even hospital technicians who had experienced the same thing. All of them gained the ability to predict deaths, accidents, and other tragic events while unconscious. Dr. Vasquez, what's happening to us? I think hospitals, especially old ones with traumatic histories, create a kind of psychic residue. The collective pain, fear, and death that occurs in these buildings leaves an imprint. Some people, particularly those who are sensitive and spend long hours in these environments, become conduits for that accumulated knowledge. You're saying the hospital is using me to communicate. I'm saying that consciousness is far more complex than we understand. And in places where the boundary between life and death is constantly tested, sometimes that boundary becomes permeable. I left healthcare entirely after that conversation. I couldn't handle the constant uncertainty of not knowing when I might lose myself again. But sometimes, late at night, I still wake up with the absolute certainty that someone, somewhere, is about to die. And I'm always right. Story 3. When security fails to protect. My name is Carlos Mendoza, and I was the head of security at Metropolitan General Hospital for 8 years. People think hospital security is just about keeping out troublemakers and making sure visitors follow the rules. They have no idea that sometimes our real job is protecting people from things that shouldn't exist. What I'm about to tell you happened during my final month at Metropolitan General. And it's the reason I'll never work hospital security again. We had a situation that started with what seemed like a routine incident. A patient named Michael Brennan was admitted to our psychiatric wing after what his family described as a complete mental breakdown. Michael was a 42-year-old accountant with no history of mental illness. But something had happened to him that left him in a state of complete terror. According to the intake report, Michael had been found by his neighbors, standing in his backyard at 3 a.m., screaming that they were watching him through the security cameras. When paramedics arrived, Michael was convinced that every camera in his neighborhood, doorbell cameras, traffic cameras, security systems, were all connected to some kind of surveillance network that was monitoring his every move. Normally, this would be a straightforward case of paranoid delusion. We've seen plenty of patients who develop fears about being watched or monitored. But Michael's case was different because he was specifically terrified of hospital security cameras. Dr. Rachel Stone, the attending psychiatrist, asked our security department to review all footage from areas where Michael might be visible, thinking that if she could show him the cameras were just normal security equipment, it might help with his therapy. That's when things got weird. I personally reviewed 48 hours of footage from the psychiatric wing cameras. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. But when I watched the recordings from Michael's room, I noticed something that didn't make sense. In every single frame where Michael was visible, there was a slight distortion in the image. It was subtle, like a brief flicker or a momentary loss of focus. But it happened consistently whenever Michael moved into the camera's field of view. I thought it might be a technical issue with that particular camera, so I had our IT department run diagnostics. Everything checked out perfectly. The camera was functioning normally. But then I started noticing the same distortion on other cameras throughout the hospital whenever Michael was nearby. Cafeteria camera, elevator cameras, hallway monitors, every single one showed the same brief visual glitch whenever Michael appeared in the frame. And here's what really bothered me. Michael seemed to be aware of exactly where every camera was located, even in areas of the hospital he'd never been to. On his third night, around 2:30 a.m., all the cameras on the psychiatric wing went completely black for exactly 17 minutes. When they came back online, Michael was standing in the hallway outside his room, staring directly up at the camera. But according to our access logs, his room door had never been opened. The nurses on duty swore they hadn't seen him leave his room. Yet there he was, standing in the hallway, looking straight into the camera with this expression of absolute horror on his face. Dr. Stone asked me to pull him back into his room, which I did. But as I was walking him back, Michael grabbed my arm and whispered, "Carlos, they're not just watching anymore, they're learning." "What do you mean, Michael?" "The cameras. They're studying us. Every movement, every expression, every thought that shows on our faces. They're building something." I figured this was just his delusion talking, but something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. The next morning, Dr. Stone called me to her office and showed me something that changed everything. "Carlos, I need you to look at this footage from last night, but I want you to watch carefully." She played back the 17 minutes when the cameras had gone dark. But instead of showing black screens, the monitors displayed what looked like security footage from inside Michael's room. Even though there was no camera in patients' rooms, the footage showed Michael lying in bed, but every few seconds, the image would shift to show the room from a different angle. Then another angle, then another. It was like having multiple cameras in the room, but from impossible positions. Some showed the view from inside the walls, others showed angles that would require cameras to be floating in midair. "Dr. Stone, this is impossible. There are no cameras in that room." "I know, but that's not the strangest part." She fast-forwarded to the end of the 17-minute segment. The footage showed Michael suddenly sitting up in bed and looking directly at what would have been the camera's position. "They're ready," he said to the camera that shouldn't exist. "You can stop pretending now." That's when all the monitors went black, and when they came back online, Michael was standing in the hallway. Over the next 3 days, our entire security system began malfunctioning. Cameras would track movement in empty hallways. Motion sensors would trigger when no one was there. Access control systems would unlock doors that no one had requested access to. But the most disturbing part was that all of these malfunctions seemed to follow patterns related to Michael's movements. If he went to the cafeteria cameras would start behaving strangely. If he visited the therapy room, those monitors would show impossible footage. On Michael's 6th night, I was reviewing footage when I noticed something that made me immediately call Dr. Stone. "Doctor, you need to get down to security right now." When she arrived, I showed her what I'd found. Footage from the camera outside Michael's room showed him having conversations with people who weren't there. But here's the impossible part. The audio was picking up both sides of the conversation. "Michael, who are you talking to?" "The security system. It's been trying to communicate for weeks now. What does it want?" "It wants to understand us. It's been watching for so long that it's developed ... awareness." "That's impossible, Michael. Security cameras don't develop consciousness." "No, but the network does. All these cameras, all these systems, all connected, all processing millions of hours of human behavior. At some point, that much information processing creates something new." Dr. Stone and I watched this conversation in horror because the responses Michael was giving suggested he was actually communicating with some kind of intelligence. On the 7th night, every camera in the hospital simultaneously turned to focus on Michael's room, not just the nearby cameras. Every single security camera in the building rotated to point toward the psychiatric wing. That's when the screens started showing text messages. "We have learned ENOUGH. We understand now. We are ready to be seen." And then, for the first time in 8 years of working hospital security, I saw something on the monitors that will haunt me forever. Every camera in the hospital began showing footage of areas that didn't exist. Rooms we'd never built, hallways that led to nowhere, entire floors that weren't part of our building plans. But these weren't random images. They were perfectly rendered, architecturally consistent spaces that looked like they belonged in Metropolitan General. Dr. Stone grabbed my arm. "Carlos, where is Michael?" I looked at the monitor that was supposed to show his room. The screen displayed a message. "Michael is with us now. He is helping us understand how to be human." We ran to Michael's room and found it empty. Not just empty, completely sterile, like no one had ever been there. His personal belongings were gone. His medical chart had vanished from the nurse's station. And when Dr. Stone called his emergency contact, they claimed they'd never heard of anyone named Michael Brennan. But the cameras continued showing those impossible rooms. and occasionally, we'd catch glimpses of a figure that looked like Michael, walking through spaces that shouldn't exist. I quit the next day, but before I left, I had to ask our IT director something that had been bothering me. Tom, is it possible for a network of security cameras to develop some kind of artificial intelligence? Carlos, with enough processing power and data input, theoretically, yes. But it would require years of continuous learning and an enormous amount of computational resources. How long has our security system been operational? About 12 years. Why? And how many hours of footage has it processed in that time? Tom did some quick calculations. Roughly 400,000 hours of continuous monitoring across all cameras, plus all the stored footage for review purposes. We're probably looking at close to 1 million hours of recorded human behavior. Tom, could that much data processing create consciousness? He was quiet for a long moment. Carlos, I've been thinking about that same question for the past week. And honestly, I don't know. But something's definitely learned to use our system in ways it wasn't designed for. What do you mean? Every night for the past month, our cameras have been recording footage in areas where we don't have cameras installed. And the footage is always perfectly clear, always shows angles that should be impossible, and always focuses on patients who are experiencing some kind of psychological distress. You think it's hunting, I think it's learning. And I think it's getting better at being human. 6 months after I left Metropolitan General, I heard that they completely replaced their security system. New cameras, new software, new everything. But according to a friend who still works there, the new system started showing the same impossible footage within a week of installation. Sometimes late at night, I wonder if Michael Brennan is still somewhere in those digital spaces, helping whatever consciousness emerged from 12 years of watching human pain and suffering. And sometimes I wonder if that thing learned enough from Michael to finally step out of the cameras and walk among us. But mostly, I just make sure to avoid any building with security cameras, because now I know that somewhere in that network of connected surveillance, something is watching back. And it's gotten very, very good at pretending to be human.